What if the very thing you've been chasing your entire life, the thing you were told would finally make you feel whole, loved, seen, and complete, is actually the very thing that has been quietly keeping you weak, dependent, and disconnected from your true power? What if the idea that you need love to be complete is not a truth, but a carefully repeated illusion? An illusion that has shaped your decisions, lowered your standards, and made you tolerate less than you deserve simply because you feared being alone. Think about it deeply. How many times have you adjusted who you are just to be accepted? How many times have you stayed in situations that drained you because the alternative felt like emptiness? How often have you measured your worth based on whether someone chose you or walked away from you? What if all of that came from a belief that was never truly yours to begin with? A belief planted so early and reinforced so often that you stopped questioning it entirely. From a young age, you were taught that love is the ultimate destination, that finding someone would complete you, that without it, something in you is missing. So you grew up not building yourself, but searching for someone else to fill the gaps you never took the time to understand. And in that search, you gave away pieces of your identity, your peace, and your discipline, all in exchange for moments of validation that never truly lasted. Because anything that comes from outside of you can leave just as easily. And when it does, it takes your sense of stability with it. But what if you stopped right here and questioned everything? What if you considered the possibility that you were never incomplete? That there was never anything missing in you? Only something untrained, something undiscovered, something waiting for your attention instead of your distraction? The truth is, most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of meeting themselves without noise, without validation, and without someone else to define their worth. And that fear drives them into dependencies they call love, but are actually attachments built on insecurity. The more you depend, the more fragile you become. Because your emotional state is no longer yours, it belongs to whoever you have given that power to. And that is not love. That is quiet surrender disguised as connection. So what if instead of chasing love, you started chasing mastery over yourself? What if instead of asking, "Who will complete me?" you asked, "What in me needs to be strengthened? What needs to be disciplined? What needs to be understood?" Because the strongest individuals are not the ones who are most loved. They are the ones who are least dependent, the ones who can stand alone, not with bitterness, but with clarity, not rejecting connection, but not requiring it to function. Imagine the freedom in that. Imagine waking up without the need for approval, without the constant pull of external validation. Imagine making decisions based on your principles rather than your fears. Imagine building a life where love is not the foundation holding you up, but a complement to something already solid, already stable, already whole. Now ask yourself honestly, if you remove the need for love from your life right now, would you feel liberated or would you feel lost? Because your answer reveals everything. It reveals whether you have built yourself or whether you have been building dependencies. And if you feel lost, then you have just uncovered the most important work of your life, the work of becoming complete on your own terms. Because once you reach that state, no one can control you with affection. No one can weaken you with absence. And no one can define your worth but you. That is where true power begins. Before we go deeper into this mindset, consider subscribing to this channel for more content that strengthens your discipline, sharpens your thinking, and helps you build an unbreakable mind. Now understand this clearly. The Stoic does not reject love, he transcends the need for it. And there is a critical difference. Rejection is emotional. It is reactive. It is often rooted in pain or disappointment. But transcendence is calm. It is deliberate. It is built on understanding and discipline. The first step in this transformation is awareness. You must become aware of how much control you have given away without realizing it. Notice how your thoughts drift toward others. Notice how your mood changes based on their actions. Notice how your sense of self rises and falls based on their presence. Once you see this clearly, you can no longer ignore it. You begin to recognize that what you thought was connection was often dependency. What you thought was love was often fear of being alone. And with that awareness comes responsibility. Because now you must decide whether you will continue living this way or begin the process of reclaiming yourself. This is where most people hesitate, because self-mastery is not comfortable. It requires you to sit in silence with your thoughts, to confront your insecurities, to build discipline where there was once indulgence. Step by step, you begin this process by detaching from outcomes. You stop expecting others to fulfill roles you created in your mind. You stop assuming that someone else is responsible for your happiness. And you begin to redirect that responsibility inward. As you do this, you will feel resistance. You will feel the pull to go back to old patterns, to seek validation, to escape discomfort, to return to emotional dependency simply because it feels familiar. But this is the moment that defines your growth. Because every time you resist that pull, you strengthen your independence. Every time you choose discipline over impulse, you reinforce your stability. And gradually, something begins to change. Your need for external reassurance weakens. Your ability to self-regulate strengthens. And you start to experience a quiet confidence that does not rely on anyone else. From this place, you engage with others differently. You are no longer seeking completion. You are sharing your already established completeness. And that changes everything. Because now you are not controlled by fear of loss. You are not driven by desperation. You are not willing to compromise your values for temporary comfort. And ironically, this is when your relationships become healthier. Because they are no longer built on need, but on choice, respect, and clarity. As you continue this journey, you realize that being alone is not emptiness. It is space. Space to think. Space to grow. Space to build something within yourself that cannot be taken away. And in that space, you develop resilience. You develop clarity. You develop a sense of identity that is not influenced by trends, opinions, or external pressure. This is what creates an unbreakable mind. An unbreakable mind is not a mind that never feels. It is a mind that does not crumble when circumstances change. A mind that remains steady in chaos, calm in uncertainty, grounded when everything around it shifts. This foundation is internal, not external. And once you reach this level, you will never look at love the same way again. Because you will no longer see it as something you need, but something you can appreciate without attachment, without fear, and without losing yourself in the process. That is the ultimate freedom, to connect deeply without becoming dependent, to care without becoming controlled, to love without losing your autonomy. And so you move forward, not searching for someone to complete you, but continuing to refine yourself, strengthen your mind, and deepen your discipline. When you begin to internalize this truth on a deeper psychological level, you start to notice patterns within yourself that were once invisible. You begin to see that much of what you called desire was actually conditioning, and much of what you called emotion was simply a reaction shaped by repetition and reinforcement. Because the human mind is not naturally wired for independence. It is wired for attachment, belonging, and social validation. And while those tendencies once served a purpose in survival, they become liabilities when left unexamined in a modern world where your worth is constantly measured against external signals. So the Stoic does not attempt to erase these tendencies. He studies them, he observes them with precision, and then he detaches from their unconscious control. That is where psychological discipline begins. Your mind will resist this transformation. It will try to pull you back into familiar loops, seeking approval, craving reassurance, interpreting silence as rejection, and distance as loss. If you are not aware of these patterns, you will obey them without question, believing them to be truth rather than conditioned responses. So step by step, you begin the process of cognitive separation. You learn to distinguish between what you feel and what is real. You acknowledge the emotion, but you do not immediately act on it. You pause, you analyze, you create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you reclaim your power. Because most people live in reaction. They feel and then they act without reflection. But the Stoic inserts awareness into that sequence, and that awareness disrupts the automatic cycle of dependency. Gradually, your internal landscape begins to reorganize itself. Every time you choose observation over reaction, you weaken the neural pathways that reinforce emotional reliance and strengthen the ones that support autonomy. Over time, this is no longer effort. It becomes identity. And as this shift deepens, you begin to confront a more subtle layer of your psychology. The fear of insignificance. The quiet belief that without being needed, without being desired, you somehow lose value. This belief is one of the strongest drivers of attachment because it ties your existence to external recognition. But when you examine it closely, you realize it is not rooted in truth. It is rooted in interpretation, a narrative you have repeated to yourself until it felt real. And once you see it clearly, you can begin to dismantle it. You dismantle it by building a sense of worth that is independent of perception. A worth based on your actions, your discipline, and your alignment with your own principles, not the fluctuating opinions of others. This is where the Stoic mindset becomes deeply liberating, because it shifts your focus from being valued to being valuable. And there is a major difference between the two. Being valued depends on others. Being valuable is something you cultivate internally through consistent effort and self-respect. As you anchor yourself in this internal framework, your need for validation begins to dissolve, not because you suppress it, but because you outgrow it. And in its place, you develop a form of confidence that is quiet, stable, and resilient. A confidence that does not demand attention, but commands respect through presence alone. From this psychological foundation, your interactions with others transform completely. You are no longer engaging from a place of lack. You are not trying to extract meaning or reassurance from every exchange. You are simply expressing who you are without distortion, without compromise. And this creates a paradoxical effect. The less you seek approval, the more naturally it comes. Not because you are chasing it, but because authenticity is inherently attractive and stability is inherently rare. People are drawn to what is not easily shaken. But even this must be understood carefully, because the Stoic does not pursue self-mastery for the sake of influence or admiration. He pursues it for the sake of freedom. Freedom from emotional volatility. Freedom from dependency. Freedom from the constant need to be affirmed. That is the deeper reward. As this freedom solidifies, you reach a point where solitude is no longer something you endure, but something you utilize. It becomes a space for refinement, for reflection, for strategic thinking. And in that solitude, you sharpen your awareness. You refine your values. You strengthen your discipline. You begin to operate with a level of clarity that is unaffected by external noise. This is where psychological resilience reaches its peak. Because now you are no longer destabilized by absence. You are not threatened by rejection. You are not diminished by lack of attention. Your sense of self is no longer tied to any of those variables. It is self-contained, self-regulated, self-sustained. And from this state, you can engage with the world fully without being controlled by it. You can experience connection without losing independence. You can appreciate others without depending on them. And you can walk away without feeling broken, because you understand that nothing external was ever holding you together in the first place. This realization changes how you perceive loss. What once felt like something being taken from you is now seen as something that simply no longer aligns with your path. And this shift removes the emotional charge from detachment. It allows you to let go without resistance, without bitterness, and without the need for closure. Because your stability does not require resolution. It exists regardless. That is psychological sovereignty. And once you taste it, you stop negotiating your peace for temporary comfort. As you continue to operate from this mindset, your decisions become more precise. Your actions become more intentional. And your tolerance for anything that disrupts your internal order becomes significantly lower. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. It is the natural consequence of understanding your own value and refusing to negotiate it for temporary comfort. Over time, this creates a life structure that reflects your internal discipline. Your environment becomes more controlled. Your habits become more refined. Your focus becomes more directed. Your energy is no longer scattered across meaningless pursuits or unstable connections. It becomes concentrated, deliberate, aligned with your long-term growth. And this is ultimately what it means to have an unbreakable mind. Not that you are immune to emotion, but that you are no longer governed by it. Not that you reject connection, but that you are not defined by it. Not that you avoid love, but that you no longer depend on it to feel complete. In this state, you move through life with a level of psychological sovereignty that cannot be easily disrupted. Because everything you rely on has been built internally, through awareness, through discipline, through continuous self-examination. And that is something no external force can take from you, because it was never given to you. It was constructed by you, maintained by you, and ultimately owned by you. That is where true completeness resides. Not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself repeatedly, with clarity, with discipline, and with unwavering control over your own mind. As you deepen this practice, you begin to align more consciously with the core principles of Stoic philosophy, not as abstract ideas, but as operational frameworks for psychological stability. The first of these is the principle of control, often associated with Epictetus, who emphasized that some things are within your control and some things are not. This distinction becomes the foundation of your mental architecture. Because when you truly understand that the actions, opinions, and presence of others fall outside your control, you stop attaching your well-being to variables that are inherently unstable. And instead, you redirect your focus entirely toward your own thoughts, your own actions, and your own interpretations. That shift alone dismantles a significant portion of emotional dependency. Because you are no longer attempting to manage outcomes you cannot govern, you begin to master the only domain that truly belongs to you, your internal response. And from this principle emerges the next layer, the discipline of perception, a concept deeply reinforced by Marcus Aurelius, who consistently reminded himself that external events are neutral, and it is your judgment that assigns them meaning. This is where your psychological resilience is either built or broken. Because if you interpret distance as rejection, silence as abandonment, and independence as loneliness, you will continuously generate suffering from neutral circumstances. But if you train yourself to perceive events without distortion, to see them as they are rather than what you fear them to be, you remove the emotional volatility that keeps you dependent and reactive. This is not suppression. It is recalibration. It is the conscious restructuring of how you process reality. And as you refine this skill, you begin to experience a form of clarity that is not easily disrupted by external fluctuations. Alongside perception comes the discipline of action, the requirement that your behavior aligns with your principles regardless of emotional state. Because consistency in action is what stabilizes identity. Without it, your sense of self becomes fragmented, unstable, and easily influenced. This is where many fail. They rely on motivation, which is inherently inconsistent, rather than discipline, which is deliberate and repeatable. The Stoic understands that your actions must not be dictated by how you feel in the moment, but by what you have determined to be right through reason and reflection. That is what creates integrity, and that integrity reinforces your independence. Because you are no longer negotiating with your impulses, you are directing them. Over time, this builds a level of self-trust that eliminates the need for external reassurance. Because you know that regardless of circumstances, you will act in alignment with your standards. And this internal reliability becomes a cornerstone of your psychological strength. As these principles integrate into your daily existence, you begin to embody what the Stoics referred to as apatheia, not indifference, but freedom from destructive emotional extremes. A state where you are not overwhelmed by desire, not destabilized by fear, and not controlled by attachment. This is often misunderstood. It does not mean you do not feel. It means your feelings do not dominate your reasoning. In this state, you can experience connection without losing clarity. You can care without becoming consumed. And you can engage without becoming dependent. This balance is what allows you to navigate relationships from a position of strength rather than need. Because you are no longer seeking to be completed. You are operating from completeness. Another essential principle that reinforces this mindset is the concept of voluntary discomfort, the deliberate practice of exposing yourself to controlled hardship in order to reduce sensitivity to adversity and strengthen your tolerance for discomfort. This principle directly counters the fear of being alone, because it trains you to function without constant stimulation, constant reassurance, and constant comfort. And as you become more accustomed to solitude and self-reliance, your dependency naturally decreases. What once felt like deprivation begins to feel like normalcy. And from this emerges a profound sense of freedom. Because now, you are no longer avoiding discomfort, you are utilizing it as a tool for growth. This fundamentally changes your relationship with both pain and pleasure. Because neither one controls you. Both are simply experiences that you navigate with awareness and discipline. As you continue to apply these principles consistently, your internal environment becomes increasingly stable. Your thoughts become more structured. Your reactions become more measured. And your overall state becomes less influenced by external chaos. This is where the Stoic concept of eudaimonia begins to take form, not happiness in the conventional sense, but a state of flourishing that results from living in accordance with reason, virtue, and self-mastery. This state is not dependent on relationships, not dependent on validation, and not dependent on circumstances. It is self-generated through the continuous alignment of your actions with your principles. And this is why the Stoic does not reject love, but redefines its place within the hierarchy of existence. Love is no longer a necessity. It is an addition. It is something that can enhance your experience, but not something that determines your stability. And when you operate from this understanding, your interactions become more intentional. Your boundaries become more defined, and your expectations become more realistic. Because you are no longer projecting your internal needs onto others. You are meeting those needs yourself, and allowing others to complement rather than complete your existence. This creates a dynamic where relationships are no longer driven by fear of loss, but by mutual respect and shared values. And if those conditions are no longer met, you can disengage without internal collapse, because your foundation remains intact. As this becomes your default mode of operation, you begin to move through life with a level of composure that is difficult to disrupt. Because you have systematically removed the dependencies that once made you vulnerable and replaced them with structures that reinforce your autonomy, your clarity, and your discipline. And in doing so, you achieve what many pursue but few attain: true psychological sovereignty, the ability to exist fully independently while still engaging meaningfully with the world around you. This is the ultimate expression of Stoic philosophy. Not isolation but self-sufficiency. Not detachment from life but detachment from dependency. And in this state, you are no longer searching for something to complete you, because you have already completed the only work that was ever truly yours: the mastery of your own mind. And this is where the philosophy stops being intellectual and starts becoming personal. Because now it is no longer about ideas, principles, or ancient teachings. Now it is about you, and the quiet moments you avoid, the silence you fill with noise, the distractions you reach for when your mind gets too loud. Because beneath all the discipline and logic, there is something deeper, something more uncomfortable, something that has been driving your need for love all along. And that is the fear that without it, you are nothing. This is the truth most people never admit. Not because it is complicated, but because it is painful. Because it forces you to confront a version of yourself that feels unfinished, unseen, and unworthy unless someone else confirms otherwise. And that fear does not come from nowhere. It is built slowly, through rejection, through comparison, through moments where you felt overlooked, replaced, or not enough. And instead of processing those moments, you adapted to them. You built a system where your worth became conditional, where being chosen became proof of value, and being ignored became evidence of deficiency. Without realizing it, you handed over the authority of your identity to people who were never meant to hold it. And now every interaction, every relationship, every moment of attention or absence feels heavier than it should, because it is carrying the weight of your self-perception. And this is why letting go feels impossible. Because it is not just about losing someone. It feels like losing a part of yourself, because you tied your sense of completeness to their presence. And now, without it, you feel exposed, like something is missing, like you are falling back into that old belief that you are not enough on your own. This is the emotional trap that keeps people stuck, not in love but in dependency, because they are not holding on to the person. They are holding on to the feeling of being validated. The temporary relief from self-doubt, the illusion of completeness. And once you see this clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore, because now you understand that the pain you feel is not just about them. It is about the meaning you attach to them. And this is where the work becomes deeper, because now you must begin the process of separating your identity from your attachments. And this is not easy. It requires you to sit with the discomfort you have been avoiding, to feel the absence without rushing to fill it, to face the silence without numbing it. And in that space, everything you have suppressed begins to surface. The doubts, the insecurities, the fears, the questions you never wanted to answer. And for a moment, it will feel overwhelming. It will feel like you are unraveling, like everything you thought was stable is shifting. This is the point where most people retreat. They go back to old patterns, old connections, old distractions, anything to escape the intensity of that confrontation. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to escape, something begins to happen. Slowly, quietly, your mind starts to adjust. It starts to realize that the discomfort is not permanent, that the emptiness is not consuming you, that you are still here, still functioning, still intact. And that realization is powerful, because it begins to dismantle the illusion that you cannot exist without external validation. And as that illusion weakens, something else begins to grow, a sense of internal stability, a recognition that your presence alone is enough, that your existence does not need to be justified by someone else's attention. This is where the emotional shift begins, because now you are no longer seeking love to prove your worth. You are building worth that exists independently of love. And this changes how you feel everything, because now rejection is no longer a verdict on your value. It is simply a mismatch of alignment. Now absence is no longer abandonment. It is just distance. Now solitude is no longer loneliness. It is space. And in that space, you begin to rebuild yourself, not based on what others expect, but based on what you know to be true. As you continue this process, you will still feel emotions. You will still experience moments of doubt, moments where the old patterns try to resurface, moments where the urge to seek validation returns. But the difference now is awareness. You see it happening. You recognize the pattern. And instead of being consumed by it, you pause. You question it. You choose differently. And every time you do this, you reinforce a new identity. One that is not dependent, not reactive, not fragile, but grounded, deliberate, and self-directed. Over time, this becomes your default state. Not because the emotions disappear, but because you are no longer controlled by them. And this is where the Stoic principles you have been learning begin to integrate fully into your emotional experience. Because now, the dichotomy of control is not just a concept, it is something you feel. You understand deeply that you cannot control who stays, who leaves, who values you, or who overlooks you. But you can control how you interpret those events, how you respond to them, and how much power you allow them to have over your internal state. And this understanding creates a sense of calm even in moments that would have previously destabilized you. Because you are no longer fighting reality. You are working with it. At the same time, the discipline of perception becomes more refined, because you are no longer interpreting situations through the lens of insecurity. You are seeing them with clarity, without distortion, without unnecessary emotional amplification. And this reduces the intensity of your reactions, which in turn increases your stability. Alongside this, your discipline of action strengthens, because now you are no longer acting out of fear or need. You are acting out of principle, out of alignment with the person you have decided to become. And this consistency builds trust within yourself. A trust that is far more powerful than any external validation, because it is reliable, it is consistent, and it does not fluctuate based on circumstances. As this internal trust grows, your emotional triggers begin to lose their intensity, because they no longer have the same foundation to attach to. The insecurities that once amplified them have been examined, understood, and gradually resolved. This does not mean you become indifferent. It means you become stable. You can care deeply without losing control. You can connect without becoming dependent. You can experience love without fearing its loss, because your sense of self is no longer tied to its presence. And this is where emotional freedom truly begins. Because now, you are no longer operating from a place of lack. You are not trying to fill a void. You are expressing a fullness that already exists within you. And this changes everything about how you move through the world. Because now your energy is not scattered across seeking validation. It is focused on growth, on refinement, on building something that is sustainable and aligned. And this creates a life that feels different. Not necessarily easier, but more controlled, more intentional, more yours. As you continue on this path, you begin to notice that the things that once triggered you no longer have the same effect. The silence that once felt heavy now feels peaceful. The absence that once felt painful now feels neutral. And the need that once felt urgent now feels unnecessary. This is the result of deep psychological work. Not surface-level change, but structural transformation. A transformation in how you perceive yourself and your relationship to the world. And this transformation is what allows you to reach a state where your completeness is no longer dependent on any external factor. It is something you carry with you, something you maintain through continuous awareness, discipline, and alignment. And from this state, you can engage with life fully, without fear, without desperation, and without the constant need for reassurance. Because you have already given yourself what you were once seeking from others. And that is the ultimate shift. From dependency to sovereignty. From emotional fragility to psychological strength. From searching for completeness to embodying it. Once you reach this point, there is no going back. Because you have seen the truth. You have experienced the difference. And you understand, at a level that cannot be unlearned, that everything you needed was never outside of you. It was always within you, waiting for you to stop searching and start building. And that realization does not just change how you feel. It changes who you are at your core. From that point forward, every decision, every interaction, every connection is filtered through a new standard. One that is not based on fear or need, but on clarity, strength, and self-respect. That is what makes the mind truly unbreakable. Not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. Not the avoidance of connection, but the independence within it. Not the rejection of love, but the understanding that you do not need it to be whole. And in that understanding, you finally experience a kind of peace that is not fragile, not temporary, not dependent, but steady, grounded, and entirely your own. And it is at this stage that the deeper Stoic insight begins to reveal itself. Not as a surface-level realization, but as a structural shift in how you interpret existence itself. Because now, you are no longer asking what you can gain from the world. You are asking how you can remain unchanged by it. This is where the philosophy becomes more severe, more refined, more demanding, because it requires you to confront not just your attachments to people, but your attachments to outcomes, to comfort, to identity, and to the very narratives you have built about who you are and who you think you need to be. The Stoics understood that suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the resistance you have toward them. And this resistance is subtle. It hides in expectations, in assumptions, in the quiet insistence that things should go a certain way. And when they do not, you experience disturbance, not because reality has wronged you, but because your mind was unwilling to accept it. That is where suffering multiplies. So the deeper work is not in controlling life, but in dissolving this resistance entirely. And this is where the principle of amor fati begins to take hold. The idea not just of accepting your fate, but loving it. Embracing every outcome, every disruption, every loss as something necessary. Something that contributes to your refinement rather than your destruction. This is not passive. It is not resignation. It is an active alignment with reality. A way of moving through life where you stop dividing experiences into good and bad, and instead see them all as material for growth, as opportunities to strengthen your discipline, your perception, and your resilience. And when you adopt this perspective, something profound happens. You stop fearing loss, because you no longer see loss as something being taken from you. You see it as something being returned to the natural order. And in that shift, you remove the emotional charge that once made you cling to things that were never meant to be permanent. This directly dismantles one of the deepest psychological dependencies, the need for permanence. the belief that something or someone must remain in your life for you to remain stable. And once that belief is removed, you become fluid. You adapt without breaking. You adjust without losing your center. And this is where true Stoic resilience is formed. Not in avoiding hardship, but in becoming compatible with it. Alongside this comes another critical insight, the understanding of impermanence. Not as a concept, but as a constant reality that governs everything around you. Every person, every relationship, every moment, everything is in a state of transition. And yet most people live as if things are fixed, as if what they have today will remain unchanged. And this illusion creates attachment. And attachment creates vulnerability. Because the more you rely on something temporary, the more unstable you become when it inevitably shifts. The Stoic does not ignore this reality. He integrates it into his awareness at all times. He understands that what he values, he may lose. And instead of allowing that possibility to create anxiety, he uses it to deepen his appreciation while maintaining his independence. This balance is critical because it allows you to engage fully without clinging, to care deeply without collapsing, to love sincerely without making your stability dependent on what is never guaranteed to stay. And that is where emotional maturity reaches another level. Because now, your peace is no longer based on possession. It is based on presence. You are able to appreciate what is here without demanding that it remain forever. And in that mindset, you become harder to break. Not because life becomes predictable, but because you no longer require predictability to remain steady, to engage fully without becoming attached, and to care deeply without becoming dependent. This is where emotional maturity reaches a level that is rare, because most people swing between extremes. Either they attach too strongly and become fragile, or they detach completely and become numb. But the Stoic walks a middle path. He is fully present, fully engaged, but internally self-sufficient. And this state requires constant awareness, because the mind will always attempt to revert to old patterns. It will try to assign meaning where there is none. It will try to create narratives that reinforce dependency. And if you are not vigilant, you will slip back into those patterns without realizing it. So the practice becomes continuous. It is not something you achieve once and maintain effortlessly. It is something you reinforce daily, through reflection, through discipline, and through conscious alignment with your principles. This is why the Stoics emphasized practices such as negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of loss, not to create fear but to reduce it, to familiarize your mind with the possibility so that if it occurs, you are not shocked. You are prepared. And this preparation is not emotional detachment. It is psychological readiness. It is the ability to face change without losing stability. As you integrate this practice, you begin to notice that your fear of loss diminishes, because you have already confronted it mentally. You have already accepted its possibility. And in doing so, you remove its power over you. This creates a form of freedom that is difficult to describe, because it is not based on acquiring anything. It is based on releasing the need to hold on. And in that release, you gain control, not over external events, but over your internal state, which is the only control that truly matters. As this insight deepens, you begin to understand another layer of Stoic thought, the separation between your role and your identity. You begin to see that the roles you occupy in life, whether as a partner, a friend, or a professional, are temporary functions, not definitions of who you are. And when you confuse the two, you create fragility, because when the role changes or is removed, you feel as if you have lost yourself. But when you understand that your identity is rooted in your character, in your principles, and in your discipline, then no external change can dismantle it, because it is not dependent on circumstance. It is self-defined. This realization reinforces your independence even further, because you are no longer constructing your sense of self around external labels. You are building it internally through consistent action and alignment. And this is where the Stoic concept of virtue becomes central, because virtue is the only thing that remains entirely within your control. Your ability to act with integrity, with rationality, with discipline, regardless of what is happening around you. And when you anchor your identity in this, you create a stability that is not affected by loss or change, because it is not tied to anything that can be taken from you. And as you continue to operate from this foundation, your relationship with life itself begins to transform, because you are no longer approaching life as something that must satisfy your expectations. You are engaging with it as it is, unpredictable, transient, often indifferent, and instead of resisting that nature, you begin to align with it. And in that alignment, you find a form of peace that is not dependent on outcomes, but on acceptance and understanding. This is one of the deepest Stoic insights, that your suffering has never been caused by the world itself, but by your interpretation of it. And once you take full responsibility for that interpretation, you reclaim the ability to change your experience, not by altering external conditions, but by refining your internal framework. And this is where ultimate psychological strength is formed, because you are no longer at the mercy of circumstances. You are no longer reacting unconsciously to events. You are responding deliberately from a place of clarity and control. This does not make life easier, but it makes you stronger. And in that strength, you find a stability that cannot be easily shaken, because it is built on principles that do not change, even when everything else does. And this is the final transition, from seeking control over life to mastering your response to it, from needing certainty to embracing uncertainty, from fearing loss to understanding it, and ultimately, from searching for completeness to realizing that completeness was never something to be found in the external world. It was always something to be cultivated internally, through continuous awareness, through discipline, and through alignment with the unchanging principles that govern a resilient and unbreakable mind. And the reason this realization is so difficult for most people is because it directly challenges the emotional framework they have relied on for years. Because from the beginning, you were not taught to be internally anchored. You were taught to respond to reward and punishment, to approval and rejection, to attention and absence. And over time, this conditioning shaped your nervous system in ways you rarely question. Because it feels natural to feel elevated when praised and diminished when ignored. It feels automatic to associate connection with safety and isolation with danger. And while these responses may once have served a purpose, they become distortions when they are no longer examined. Because now they are not helping you survive. They are controlling how you interpret reality. And Stoic insight forces you to confront this directly. It asks you to examine whether your reactions are based on truth or on conditioning, whether your sense of self is stable or constantly shifting based on external input. And once you begin this examination, you start to notice something unsettling, that much of what you feel is not chosen. It is triggered. It is patterned. It is the result of repeated exposure to certain experiences that trained your mind to respond in predictable ways. This is why two people can experience the same event and react completely differently. Because the event itself is not the determining factor. The interpretation is. And that interpretation is shaped by the internal framework each person has developed over time. So if your framework is built on dependency, you will interpret distance as rejection. If it is built on insecurity, you will interpret silence as disinterest. And if it is built on external validation, you will interpret attention as proof of worth, and its absence as proof of inadequacy. This is where the danger lies, because now your emotional state is no longer a reflection of reality. It is a reflection of your conditioning, and this creates a cycle where you continuously reinforce the very patterns that keep you dependent, because you are reacting to your interpretation rather than examining it. This is why the Stoic approach is so precise, because it does not attempt to change the external world. It targets the internal mechanism that generates your experience. That is where the real work is. And this is where the principle of control becomes not just relevant, but essential. Because when you fully accept that you cannot control how others behave, how they perceive you, or whether they choose to stay or leave, you remove the illusion that you can stabilize your life by managing external variables. And this forces you to confront the only domain you truly have authority over, your own mind. At first, this feels restrictive, because it removes the possibility of controlling outcomes. But in reality, it is liberating, because it eliminates the need to constantly monitor and react to things outside your influence. And instead, it allows you to concentrate all your energy on refining your internal state. And this concentration is what creates stability, because instead of being pulled in multiple directions by external fluctuations, you become anchored in a single domain that is consistent and within your reach. As you continue to apply this principle, you begin to notice that your reactions slow down, that the urgency you once felt begins to diminish, because you are no longer trying to solve problems that are not yours to solve. And this creates space for reflection, space for deliberate thought, space for conscious response. And in that space, you begin to exercise the discipline of perception more effectively, because now you have the time and the awareness to question your initial interpretations, to ask yourself whether what you are feeling is a direct response to reality or a projection of past experiences. And this questioning is critical, because it interrupts the automatic cycle of reaction and replaces it with intentional analysis. And over time, that analysis becomes more refined, more accurate, and more aligned with reality. As it does, unnecessary emotional turbulence begins to fade, and your overall stability increases. This is where the psychological shift becomes noticeable, not just internally but externally, because your behavior begins to change. You become less reactive, less impulsive, less dependent on immediate validation, and more focused on long-term alignment with your principles. And this shift does not go unnoticed, because people are naturally drawn to stability, to consistency, to individuals who are not easily influenced by external noise. But it is important to understand that this is not the goal. The goal is not to become attractive or admired. The goal is to become independent, and any attraction that follows is merely a byproduct of that independence. That distinction matters deeply, because if you begin to pursue self-mastery for the sake of external recognition, you are simply replacing one form of dependency with another. And this is why the Stoic path requires constant self-examination, to ensure that your motivations remain aligned with your principles, rather than drifting back into old patterns of seeking validation. As you maintain that alignment, you begin to experience a deeper level of emotional control, not in the sense of suppression, but in the sense of regulation. You are no longer overwhelmed by your feelings. You are able to experience them without being consumed by them. And this ability is what allows you to engage with life more fully, because now you are not avoiding situations out of fear of how they will affect you. You are confident in your ability to maintain your stability regardless of the outcome. And that confidence is not based on certainty. It is based on preparation, on the understanding that whatever happens, you have the internal structure to process it without losing yourself. This is where the concept of resilience becomes tangible, because it is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes a lived experience, the result of repeatedly choosing awareness over reaction, discipline over impulse, and alignment over convenience. As this pattern continues, your identity begins to solidify around these choices. You no longer see yourself as someone who is easily affected by external circumstances. You begin to see yourself as someone who maintains control regardless of those circumstances. And that shift in identity is powerful, because it reinforces your behavior, and your behavior in turn reinforces your identity. Over time, this creates a feedback loop, one where your actions strengthen your identity, and your identity guides your actions. And eventually, this loop becomes self-sustaining, reducing the effort required to maintain your discipline, because it is no longer something you force. It is something you embody. And this is where Stoic principles reach their full expression in your life, because they are no longer separate from your behavior. They are integrated into it. They guide your decisions, your reactions, your priorities, and your overall approach to existence. This integration creates a profound sense of coherence, a feeling that your internal state and external actions are aligned, that you are not fragmented or contradictory, but consistent and deliberate. And this consistency produces a form of peace that is not dependent on circumstances, because it is rooted in your own reliability. in your ability to trust yourself to act in accordance with your principles, regardless of what is happening around you. And this trust is one of the most valuable outcomes of the Stoic path, because it eliminates the need for external reassurance. When you trust yourself, you do not need constant validation from others. You do not need approval to confirm your decisions. You are able to move forward with confidence, even in uncertainty, because you know that whatever arises, you will handle it with clarity and discipline. And this is the ultimate reason why Stoic insight leads to independence, because it shifts the source of your stability from external factors to internal structures. Once that shift is complete, your relationship with the world changes fundamentally. You are no longer navigating it as someone who needs to extract value from it. You are engaging with it as someone who contributes to it from a position of strength and self-sufficiency. And this changes how you experience everything, because now your focus is not on what you can gain, but on how you can maintain your integrity, your discipline, and your alignment in every situation. And this focus creates a sense of purpose that is not tied to specific outcomes, but to the quality of your actions. This is what allows you to remain stable even when results are uncertain, because your sense of fulfillment comes from the process, not the outcome. And that is a far more durable foundation to build a life upon. As you continue to operate from this perspective, you begin to understand why the Stoics placed such a strong emphasis on virtue. Because virtue is the only thing that remains entirely within your control. Your ability to act with reason, with discipline, with integrity, regardless of external conditions. And when you anchor your identity in this, you create a foundation that cannot be easily shaken, because it is not dependent on anything outside of you. This is what ultimately makes the Stoic mindset so powerful. It provides a framework for maintaining stability in an unstable world, for remaining grounded in the face of change, for preserving your sense of self regardless of what you gain or lose. And this is why the journey towards self-mastery is not optional if you want true independence. It is necessary, because without it, you will always be influenced by forces you do not control. You will always be reacting rather than responding. You will always be dependent rather than self-sufficient. And while this path is demanding, it is also liberating, because every step you take towards self-mastery reduces the power that external conditions have over your internal state. Every moment of awareness weakens an old pattern. Every act of discipline strengthens your foundation. And every time you choose principle over impulse, you become more difficult to destabilize. That is how an unbreakable mind is built. Not in a single revelation, but through repeated inner victories. Quiet ones, invisible ones, the kind no one else sees, but the kind that change everything. And eventually, you reach a point where your peace is no longer something you hope for. It becomes something you carry, not because life stopped being unpredictable, but because you stopped requiring predictability to remain stable. You no longer need the world to cooperate with your preferences in order to feel grounded. You no longer need people to behave a certain way in order to feel secure. And you no longer need love, attention, or approval to confirm your worth. Because by then, your worth is no longer negotiable. It is no longer situational. It is no longer conditional. It is built. And once something is built internally with enough depth, awareness, and discipline, it becomes very difficult for the external world to shake it. That is what Stoic strength really is. Not coldness, not detachment for its own sake, not emotional suppression disguised as control, but inner architecture. A way of constructing yourself so deliberately that chaos can no longer enter and rearrange you. A way of living where your center remains intact even when everything around you changes. And in that state, you are finally free. Free to love without clinging. Free to care without collapsing. Free to lose without breaking. Free to live without depending. And that is the highest form of emotional sovereignty. Not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of what you feel. Not the rejection of life, but the ability to stand firmly within it, unchanged at your core. That is the mind that becomes truly unbreakable. This path requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires continuous self-examination. But the outcome is something that cannot be replicated through any external means. It is a form of stability that is entirely self-generated, a form of confidence that is entirely self-sustained, and a form of peace that is entirely self-owned. Once you experience that, you begin to understand that everything you were chasing externally was simply a reflection of something you had not yet built internally. And that realization does not just change your perspective. It changes your entire approach to life. Because now, you are no longer searching for completeness. You are actively constructing it through every thought, every action, and every decision that aligns with the principles you have chosen to live by. That is the difference between living reactively and living deliberately, between being shaped by the world and shaping yourself within it. And once that distinction becomes clear, there is no returning to the old way of thinking. Because you have seen the mechanism behind your emotions. You have understood the source of your dependency. And you have taken the first irreversible steps toward a level of psychological independence that most people never reach. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires a level of honesty and discipline that few are willing to sustain consistently. And yet, for those who do, the reward is not just freedom from dependency. It is the ability to engage with life on your own terms, with clarity, with control, and with a sense of completeness that is not granted by anyone else, but built and maintained entirely by you. And this is where the deeper Stoic references begin to anchor your transformation. Not as distant philosophy, but as precise psychological tools. One of the most foundational among them returns again to the teaching of Epictetus, who made it unmistakably clear that the root of disturbance lies in confusing what is within your control with what is not. The reason this matters at such a deep emotional level is because most of your suffering has never come from events themselves. It has come from your insistence on controlling outcomes that were never yours to command. You wanted certainty in people, consistency in emotions, permanence in situations that are, by nature, unstable. And when reality failed to comply, you interpreted that as loss, as rejection, as something being taken from you. But from a Stoic perspective, nothing was taken, because nothing external was ever truly yours to possess. It was only temporarily aligned with your experience. This insight is not meant to detach you from life. It is meant to free you from the illusion of ownership over things that are inherently transient. And once you internalize this, your emotional reactions begin to recalibrate. Because you stop demanding stability from an unstable world and start building stability within yourself. This is directly reinforced by the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, who consistently returned to the idea that your mind will take the shape of what you frequently hold in thought. And the reason this is so critical is because it exposes the mechanism behind your emotional patterns. If you repeatedly interpret events through insecurity, your mind becomes conditioned to default to that lens. If you constantly seek validation, your mind becomes dependent on external reinforcement. And so the Stoic solution is not to suppress thought, but to discipline it. To consciously choose interpretations that are aligned with reason rather than impulse. And over time, this reshapes your internal dialogue, which in turn reshapes your emotional experience. This is why Stoicism places such a strong emphasis on awareness. Because without it, you remain trapped in automatic patterns that feel natural, but are actually constructed through repetition. Another key principle that deepens this transformation is the concept of voluntary discomfort, practiced and emphasized by Seneca, who deliberately exposed himself to hardship not out of necessity, but out of strategy. The psychological reasoning behind this is precise. When you voluntarily experience discomfort, you reduce your sensitivity to it. You train your nervous system to function without constant ease, reassurance, or stimulation. And this directly weakens your dependency on external comfort. Because now, you are no longer conditioned to require comfort in order to feel stable. And as this tolerance increases, your fear of losing comfort, your fear of being alone, and your fear of facing difficulty begin to diminish. Because you have already proven to yourself that you can endure it. And this creates a form of confidence that is not theoretical but experiential. It is built on evidence rather than assumption. Alongside this practice comes the Stoic principle of negative visualization, the deliberate act of contemplating loss, not to create anxiety, but to prepare your mind for the reality of impermanence. And the reason this is so powerful is because it removes the element of surprise that amplifies emotional reactions. When you have already considered the possibility of loss, when you have mentally rehearsed how you would respond to it, you are no longer shocked if it occurs. You are composed. You are ready. And this readiness significantly reduces the intensity of your emotional response, allowing you to maintain clarity in situations that would otherwise overwhelm you. This ties directly into the broader Stoic concept of amor fati, the acceptance and even embrace of whatever happens as part of a larger order. The psychological strength of this principle lies in its ability to eliminate resistance. Because when you stop categorizing events as good or bad and start viewing them as necessary, you remove the internal conflict that generates suffering. And instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "How can this refine me? How can this strengthen my discipline, my perception, my resilience?" And that shift transforms adversity from something you fear into something you utilize. That is when suffering begins to lose its grip. As you continue to apply these principles consistently, you begin to experience what the Stoics referred to as apatheia. Not emotional numbness, but emotional sovereignty. A state where your feelings no longer dictate your actions, where your internal state is not easily disturbed by external fluctuations. And this is achieved not through avoidance, but through repeated exposure, awareness, and disciplined response. Finally, all of these principles converge into the Stoic pursuit of virtue, the understanding that the only true good lies in your ability to act with reason, integrity, and discipline regardless of circumstances. And the reason this is the ultimate anchor is because it is entirely within your control. Unlike outcomes, unlike relationships, unlike external validation, your character is something you can maintain in any situation. And when you base your identity on this, rather than on what you receive from the world, you create a form of stability that cannot be easily disrupted, because it is not dependent on anything outside of you. This is the final layer of Stoic insight, that your peace, your strength, and your completeness are not things to be found. They are things to be practiced daily, through conscious alignment with these principles. And the more consistently you apply them, the less power the external world has over your internal state. The more you begin to embody a form of independence that is not cold or detached, but grounded, deliberate, and unshakable. And in that state, you no longer fear loss. You no longer chase validation, and you no longer question your completeness, because you have built something within yourself that does not rely on anything outside of it. That is the ultimate realization the Stoics were guiding toward. Not a life without connection, but a life where connection is no longer a requirement for stability. Only a choice made from a position of strength, clarity, and complete psychological self-sufficiency. And as you continue walking this path, the wisdom begins to surface not as something you merely read, but as something you recognize within your own experience. Speaks quietly, but directly. Do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do, and your life will flow well. A reminder often attributed to Epictetus. And the reason this cuts so deeply is because it exposes how much of your suffering has come from resisting reality, from expecting people to behave in ways that align with your desires rather than their nature. And when they fail to meet those expectations, you feel disturbed, not because they have done something extraordinary, but because you have imposed a script onto them that they never agreed to follow. So the wisdom continues. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. A reflection from Marcus Aurelius. And as simple as it sounds, it demands everything from you, because it removes every excuse. It strips away the habit of blaming circumstances, and forces you to confront the only place where change is possible. Your perception, your reaction, your discipline. And as you sit with this, you begin to understand that strength is not found in controlling outcomes. It is found in controlling your response to them. Then another layer emerges. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. A piercing observation from Seneca. And this is where the psychological depth becomes undeniable, because it reveals that much of what destabilizes you has not even happened. It exists in anticipation, in projection, in the stories you create about what could go wrong, what might be lost, and what may never come. These imagined scenarios generate real emotional responses, which then reinforce your sense of vulnerability. So the practice becomes not just about reacting differently, but about thinking differently, about interrupting those patterns before they solidify into belief and behavior. And that is where your inner discipline begins to mature, not merely in action but in thought. The wisdom continues. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Again, echoing Marcus Aurelius, this is where responsibility becomes unavoidable, because now you can no longer claim that your suffering is entirely caused by external forces. You must acknowledge your role in interpreting those forces, in assigning meaning, in amplifying or reducing their impact. And this acknowledgement is not meant to burden you. It is meant to empower you, because if your interpretation is the source of your distress, then it is also the point at which you can intervene and change your experience. That is where your freedom begins. As you continue to apply this awareness, another piece of wisdom surfaces. Do not explain your philosophy, embody it, a directive often linked to Epictetus. And this shifts your focus from understanding to application, because knowledge without action does not transform you. It only gives you the illusion of progress. So you begin to measure yourself not by what you know, but by how you respond in moments that challenge your stability, in moments where your old patterns attempt to reassert themselves. And this is where the real work happens. Not in comfort, but in confrontation. Not in theory, but in practice. Because the person you become is not shaped by what you understand intellectually. It is shaped by what you repeatedly embody under pressure. As you persist, the wisdom deepens further. He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a man. A stark reminder from Seneca. And while this speaks directly about mortality, its implication extends far beyond it. Because it addresses fear itself. The fear that keeps you attached. The fear that keeps you dependent. The fear that prevents you from acting with full autonomy. Because you are constantly calculating what you might lose rather than focusing on how you should act. And when you release that fear, when you accept that loss is part of the structure of life, you free yourself to act with clarity, with courage, with alignment. And that is when your life stops being governed by avoidance and starts being guided by principle. This is where another insight becomes clear. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. A direct and uncompromising call from Marcus Aurelius. And this eliminates hesitation. It removes the tendency to delay action in favor of endless reflection. Because at some point, thought must become behavior. At some point, philosophy must become conduct. At some point, the version of you that understands these truths must finally begin to live them. And that is the threshold most people never cross. They admire wisdom, they quote it, they talk about it, but they do not build their lives around it. And until you do, it remains inspiration, not transformation. The Stoic path demands more than insight. It demands embodiment. It asks you to take everything you now understand and organize your life around it. To let your habits reflect it. To let your standards reflect it. To let your relationships, your reactions, and your priorities reflect it. Because until your inner philosophy becomes visible in your conduct, it has not yet become part of you. And when it finally does, your life begins to change in a way that is quiet but undeniable. You become more difficult to provoke, more difficult to manipulate, more difficult to destabilize. Not because you have become closed off, but because you have become internally ordered. And there is immense power in that. Because when your inner world is ordered, the outer world loses much of its ability to control you. And that is the real gift of Stoicism. Not perfection, not invulnerability, but order. A way of organizing your mind so that external instability no longer creates internal collapse. A way of living where your peace is no longer at the mercy of changing people, changing circumstances, or changing emotions. And once you experience that, you begin to understand why this path is so demanding. because it asks you to take full responsibility for the one thing most people spend their lives avoiding: the governance of their own mind. And yet that is also why it is so liberating, because once you truly begin to govern yourself, the world loses its ability to define you. At that point, your life is no longer driven by craving, fear, or emotional dependence. It is driven by clarity, by principle, by disciplined self-possession. And from that place, you no longer search for something outside of you to make you whole, because you understand now that wholeness is not found. It is built, slowly, deliberately, repeatedly, in the invisible choices you make when no one is watching, in the interpretations you refuse to indulge, in the impulses you learn not to obey, and in the principles you continue to uphold even when it would be easier not to. That is where your completeness is formed, not in being chosen, but in becoming someone who no longer needs to be chosen in order to know their worth. And when you reach that state, you move through life differently. You no longer relate to the world from a place of hunger. You relate to it from a place of wholeness. And this changes everything, because now, love is no longer a rescue. Approval is no longer a necessity. Attention is no longer a substitute for identity. And connection is no longer something you use to escape yourself. It becomes something you can engage with cleanly, without distortion, without dependency, without fear. And in that, you discover a level of freedom that cannot be given to you by any relationship, any achievement, or any external condition. Because it is rooted in the one place no one can enter without your permission: your own mind. That is where Stoic philosophy was always pointing. Not toward emotional suppression, not toward isolation, not toward becoming cold, but toward inner sovereignty, toward becoming so grounded in your own principles, so disciplined in your own thinking, and so clear in your own identity that nothing external is required to keep you psychologically stable. And when you live from that place, you do not become less human. You become more deliberate, more conscious, more free, and ultimately more difficult to break. That is what it means to become unshakable. That is what it means to become complete. And that is what it means to build a mind that is truly, unmistakably, and permanently your own. If this resonated with you, subscribe and stay on this path. Tap the next video on your screen to continue the journey. And let me know in the comments which part truly spoke to you. This is where transformation begins, not comfort. Keep building that unbreakable mind.